The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It hung in the air like smoke, rolling off the North Sea and settling over the muddy runways of Boxted. The wind clawed at the tents, snapped at the canvas of parked aircraft, and scattered the smell of damp oil and burned glycol across the dispersal area. Mechanics in heavy coats moved like shadows between the hulking shapes of Republic-built fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts, their radial engines ticking as they cooled. Major Hubert Zemke stood under the edge of a hangar, collar up, eyes fixed on the silhouette of his squadron's new mounts. The 56th Fighter Group had been reassigned from the familiar curves of P-38 seconds and Spitfires to this machine. The first production P-47D2 seconds had arrived 2 weeks earlier, and already they were being cursed across the airfields of East Anglia. "They built us a goddamn tractor," one pilot muttered. He wasn't wrong. Fully fueled and armed, the P-47 weighed more than 10,000 pounds, nearly double that of the Luftwaffe's Messerschmitt Bf-109G. With its wide fuselage and broad elliptical wings, it looked less like a fighter and more like something meant to tow one. Zemke watched as Sergeant Mullins, one of his ground crew, tested the throttle. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp came alive with a mechanical roar, coughing smoke and flame before finding its rhythm 2,000 horsepower caged beneath a steel cowling. The earth trembled. The sound wasn't sharp, like a Merlin or Daimler-Benz. It was deeper, a furnace-throated growl that vibrated through the chest. On paper, the engineers at Republic Aviation had promised miracles. The P-47 could climb to 30,000 feet, dive faster than any Allied aircraft in existence, and carry 8 Browning, 50-caliber machine guns, 4 per wing. But in practice, the numbers betrayed the men flying it. In the air, the Thunderbolt climbed like a cathedral. German fighters, the Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs they faced, daily could twist and roll in half the time. Where the Spitfire turned inside a barn, the Thunderbolt needed a county. The early missions were cruel lessons. Over Lille, over Rouen, the P-47 seconds struggled to keep up with the bombers they were meant to protect. Luftwaffe pilots dove in from above, unleashed their 20mm cannons, and vanished before the Americans could even line up a shot. The Thunderbolts lumbered after them, engines howling, only to find themselves too slow to climb and too heavy to turn. In 1 week of March, Zemke lost 3 aircraft to mechanical failure, 2 to enemy action. 1 simply never returned. Inside the mess hall, the mood soured. RAF pilots from neighbouring stations joked about the flying milk bottle. They called it the Jug, a name that would later become iconic, but in those first cold months it was an insult. "Bloody Yank tanks," one Spitfire pilot smirked over tea. "Can't imagine what Jerry thinks when he sees that thing lumbering in." Zemke didn't answer. He knew what Jerry thought. Reports from captured Luftwaffe interrogations confirmed it. German pilots saw the Thunderbolt as slow, clumsy, and harmless, an easy target for the swift Messerschmitt. Still, Zemke wasn't ready to write it off. He had spent too long studying the mechanical heart of his aircraft. The P-47 wasn't built to dance, it was built to endure. The airframe could withstand dive speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, and the engineers had quietly tested it past Mach 0.74 before structural vibrations became dangerous. At those speeds, the controls stiffened, air compressed beneath the wings, and other aircraft lighter ones began to shudder apart. The P-47 did not. Its thick skin, its radial bulk, the same weight that pilots cursed made it almost indestructible. Zemke ran his hand along the edge of a wing. The aluminum was cold and wet. Beneath it lay 8 guns, each capable of spitting 850 rounds per minute. In a single 3-second burst, the Thunderbolt could throw over 100 pounds of metal into the air. He thought of that number often, not as a statistic, but as potential. That night, the squadron gathered in the operations tent. The map board glowed beneath the dim red lamps, tracing the line of the next day's mission, an escort run towards Saint-Omer. Bomber Command expected heavy resistance. Zemke listened as the briefing officer rattled through altitudes and rendezvous times. The smell of wet leather and coffee filled the room. When the meeting ended, Zemke stayed behind, staring at the contour lines of the map. "Major," Captain Mahurin said quietly, "if we can't turn with them, we'll never stop them." Zemke didn't answer immediately. He watched the rain smear across the tent flap, heard the distant thrum of engines being tested in the dark. "No," he said finally, "we can't turn, so maybe we shouldn't." Mahurin frowned. "Then what the hell do we do?" Zemke's eyes stayed on the map. "We dive." It was a simple word, almost foolish, spoken aloud. But the idea had been gnawing at him for weeks. If the P-47 couldn't climb or turn as quickly as the enemy, then it had to fight on the one axis where no aircraft could follow the vertical. In a dive, gravity and horsepower became allies. The Thunderbolt's weight turned into acceleration. The same mass that doomed it in a turn fight now pulled it like an anchor through the air, a controlled fall that no German pilot could match. He remembered a test flight 2 days earlier. High above the overcast, he had pushed the throttle forward and felt the aircraft drop like a meteor. The altimeter spun, the control stick grew rigid, and the sky blurred into a white tunnel. At 480 miles per hour indicated, the P-47 didn't tremble. It sang. That night, Zemke wrote a single line in his flight log. "The weight isn't a flaw. It's a weapon if you use it right." By dawn, the storm had cleared. The runway steamed under a weak sun. Ground crews wiped frost from canopies, loaded belts of .50 caliber ammunition, and fueled the massive Thunderbolts until their wings sagged slightly under the weight. Zemke climbed into his cockpit, gloved hands brushing against the cold metal of the throttle. Around him, the other engines came alive one by one, a rolling thunder that shook the field. He looked out across the line of silver machines, misunderstood, mocked, but waiting. Somewhere out there, beyond the grey horizon, were German pilots who still believed the Thunderbolt couldn't catch them. They wouldn't believe it for long. The sky above the channel that morning was a cathedral of cold light. A fragile spring haze drifted eastward, its silver threads wrapping around the wings of 16 Republic P-47Cs, belonging to the 56th Fighter Group. The men who flew them were new to this country, new to this war, and, most damningly, still new to their own machines. Major Hubert Zemke led from the front, his canopy already misted with the condensation of altitude. Below him, the English coast fell away into chalk cliffs and gun batteries. Somewhere ahead, across a dozen invisible miles, waited the Luftwaffe. "Throttle back, check oxygen flow," came the order over the radio. His voice was steady, clipped. No one disobeyed Zemke's wolf pack. Not yet, anyway. The P-47 had been born of brute philosophy. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced more horsepower than some bombers, and its rugged frame, 10,000 pounds fully loaded, could take flak hits that would shred a Spitfire or Mustang. But at that stage of the war, few pilots saw it as a blessing. Their job that day was simple on paper: escort a formation of B-17 seconds on a shallow raid to Abbeville. For the last month, RAF squadrons had been mocking the new arrivals. "Flying barn doors," one British pilot had called them in the pub at Boxted. "You'll frighten the Germans, with the noise, not your aim." Zemke remembered that line as he checked his altimeter. 20,000 feet, he could feel the drag creeping in as the P-47's thick wing fought the air. "This ship," he'd told his men a week prior, "isn't a dancer, it's a hammer. You just have to find the right nail." The first enemy contact came in just after 0930 hours. 24 Bf, 109 Gs from Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Lieutenant Horst Krupinski, dropped through the haze like falling steel. They'd been waiting for the Thunderbolts. "Bandits, 10 o'clock high," yelled Lieutenant Bob Johnson, his voice half static, half adrenaline. Zemke craned his neck. He could see them thin, sharp, predatory shapes slicing into the bomber stream. "Break left." The formation scattered. Instant chaos. The Thunderbolt's heavy airframe groaned under the sudden turn. Johnson pulled the stick hard, feeling his ribs press against his seat harness. His airspeed bled fast, too fast. The Messerschmitts were dancing now, cutting inside his circle like wolves at the throat. A line of 20mm tracers split the sky past his canopy. Another Thunderbolt, Lieutenant Fred Christensen, spun downward, trailing smoke. "God damn it, we can't turn with them," Johnson shouted. Zemke knew it too. The Germans could climb and turn inside their radius every time. He'd seen it before. It was why they were losing pilots and confidence by the week. He made a decision. "Follow me, dives only. Keep your throttle wide open and don't stop until you're past 400. He shoved the nose forward. The P-47 responded like a falling anvil. At first, it was just gravity. Then it became something else. The massive weight of the Thunderbolt began converting altitude into sheer, terrifying speed. The Mach meter quivered past 0.65, then 0.7. At 20,000 feet, that meant roughly 450 miles per hour. The control stick stiffened, the airflow slamming into the tailplane so hard it threatened to lock. "Watch your trim! You'll compress!" Zemke shouted. Johnson followed, heart pounding. The noise was a physical thing, the wind roaring so violently it drowned out the engine. For a moment, he thought the wings would tear clean off. But the Germans couldn't follow. The 109 seconds began to shake, their narrow wings fluttering as they tried to match the dive. Then, one by one, they peeled away, forced to recover or risk structural failure. "Christ, they're pulling out!" someone yelled over the radio. Zemke leveled out at 12,000 feet, throttled back, and swung wide in a climbing arc. The Thunderbolt climbed slowly, but steadily, like a wounded bull refusing to die. Ahead, one of the Bf 109 seconds was still disengaging. Nose high, trying to regain altitude. He lined it up. 8. 50 caliber Browning guns spat flame. In less than 2 seconds, 100 rounds of armor-piercing and incendiary ammunition ripped across the Germans' fuselage. The 109 exploded mid-climb, wings folding inward before disintegrating. The radio erupted in disbelief. "Jesus, Zemke got him, in a climb." But Zemke wasn't celebrating. He was thinking. That moment, the dive, the flatten out, the kill wasn't luck. It was physics. Back at Boxted, the debriefing room smelled of oil, sweat, and wet wool. The men were still shaking from the fight. Zemke stood at the front of the mapboard, chalk in hand. "You can't turn with them. You can't climb with them," he said, drawing 2 lines, theirs shallow, the Germans steep. "But in a dive? You own the sky. Use gravity as your gun." He explained what had happened in the air. The P-47's massive weight gave it an unmatched terminal velocity. Once it dropped, it kept dropping faster, longer, harder. The Messerschmitts, light and agile, simply couldn't survive the same speeds. Their wings would flutter, their elevators freeze. "So, you dive through," Zemke said. "You don't break off when you see them, you punch through their formation like a bullet. Then you climb again and do it all over." Silence. Then someone muttered, "Through their formation?" Zemke nodded. "Straight through. It's the only way you'll live." That phrase, "through their formation," would soon become legend. Word of Zemke's theory spread across airfields like wildfire. The RAF scoffed at first. To them, it sounded suicidal. Squadron leader Hugh Dundas reportedly laughed when he heard it. "The bloody Americans are teaching themselves to dive through the enemy? They'll be scrap before they hit the channel." But over the next month, reports started coming in. April 20. 4 P-47 seconds from the 61st Squadron engaged 8 FW 190 seconds near Lille. 3 confirmed kills, no losses. April 27. Zemke's group intercepted a staffel of 109 seconds and dove straight through their center. 2 kills by Major Francis Gabreski. Each time, the same story repeated. They used their weight as a weapon. By late April, the men of the 56th were changing. They stopped calling the Thunderbolt a brute. They started calling it the Jug, short for Juggernaut. Pilots began to treat their altitude like currency. The higher they climbed before combat, the more money in the bank they had to spend in a dive. They learned to dive with intent, to ride the line between control and compression. In the ready room, Zemke wrote one final rule on the blackboard. If you can't outturn him, outfall him. It was more than a tactic. It was a revelation. The P-47, mocked and misunderstood, had just discovered its soul. The wind howled down the taxiway, thick with the smell of aviation fuel and rain. Mechanics crouched under tarps, hands blackened with grease, tightening bolts on cowling panels that vibrated loose after every mission. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was a monster that demanded constant feeding oil, spark plugs, belts, ammunition. But it was also becoming something far more important, a puzzle that the Americans were beginning to solve. Inside a small, drafty Nissan hut near the hangars, a group of men gathered around a chalkboard. The room was cluttered with flight charts, oxygen masks, and mugs half filled with cold coffee. At the center stood Major Hubert Zemke and Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, both still in flight jackets. Pinned to the wall were the latest 13 Fighter Command reports. Scribbled in grease pencil were two words that would change aerial combat over Europe: dive compression. Every pilot who flew the Thunderbolt in combat had felt it. Past a certain point, usually somewhere around Mach 0.7, the stick turned to stone. The nose refused to rise. Some pilots described it as flying into a wall of air. Others, less poetically, just said the jug tried to kill you. On the 30th of April 1943, Lieutenant Bill Dunham nearly became another statistic. During a mock dive over the coast, his airspeed climbed to 480 miles per hour. At 25,000 feet, the control column locked solid. He couldn't move it an inch. Only by slamming the throttle to idle and holding his breath through a near blackout did he regain control before the ground claimed him. His after-action report, now clipped to Zemke's folder, read in plain typewriter ink, "Aircraft unresponsive at high speed." Tailplane shudder noted, "Recovery achieved at approx. 8,000 feet. Recommend further test of control surfaces." It was no isolated case. The Air Force Historical Research Agency archives show that in March alone, 5 P-47 seconds were lost to high-speed compressibility dives. 2 pilots never returned. But instead of abandoning the tactic, Zemke and his men did the opposite. They decided to understand it. In early May, a team from Republic Aviation and the U.S. Army Air Technical Service Command arrived at Boxted. They brought instruments, data sheets, and an unshakable belief that science could explain the violence of the sky. Captain Robert F. Johnson, then a young pilot with the 61st Squadron, watched as technicians fitted strange pressure gauges and recording barographs into the cockpits of several P-47Ds. The experiment was simple. Measure what happened when a jug screamed earthward at terminal speed. Flight records from May 10 show Zemke himself volunteered for the first test. He took off in P-47D, Spirit of Atlantic City, NJ, and climbed to 30,000 feet. Once there, he pointed the nose down and pushed the throttle wide open. At 25,000 feet, the altimeter needle blurred. At 20,000, the plane began to tremble. By 18,000, the entire airframe screamed. The onboard recorder later confirmed what Republic engineers suspected. The P-47 was. In that moment, Zemke was traveling faster than any man alive in a piston fighter. He barely pulled out in time. After landing, sweat soaking his flight cap, he simply muttered to the mechanics, "That's as fast as she'll go." But the data told a different story. The tail didn't fail. The wings didn't tear. The jug held. The engineers concluded that while the pilot temporarily lost elevator authority due to compressibility, the formation of shock waves on the tailplane, the airframe itself could survive speeds that would destroy most enemy aircraft. The P-47, they realized, wasn't unsafe. It was untamed. For the next 2 weeks, Zemke's Wolfpack turned the airfield into a test range. Pilots practiced controlled dives at various altitudes, measuring recovery thresholds. Zemke, Mahurin, and Gabreski worked side by side with engineers to chart what would become the combat dive procedure officially issued by the 8 Fighter Command that June. It read, "Maintain full throttle. Keep the dive angle below 45 degrees. At 20,000 feet, reduce power to prevent overspeed. Begin gentle recovery by 15,000. Do not exceed Mach 0.74. It sounded simple, but its implications were revolutionary. The Thunderbolt had gone from an aircraft to be feared by its pilots to one that weaponized fear itself. Man in the 56th now knew that if he had altitude, he had life. Climb before combat, Zemke drilled into his men. You don't win the fight in the turn, you win it in the fall. On May 18, during a routine bomber escort over the Ruhr, the 56th met 20 Bf-109Gs of JG-2 Richthofen. This time, Zemke ordered his formation to stay high and loose, no tight turns, no dogfights. When the Germans dove in, the Americans didn't scatter, they fell. 12 Thunderbolts dropped through the formation in unison, guns blazing. The sound of 8 Browning machine guns per aircraft tore the air apart. In under 20 seconds, they were past the enemy, through them too fast to counterattack. German reports later recovered from captured documents describe the engagement with confusion. Enemy aircraft attacked from above in steep descent, firing continuously, unable to follow due to control stiffness at high speed. Losses: 4 aircraft not returned. It was the first recorded successful dive-through assault by the US 8th Air Force. From that day forward, the tactic became gospel. By June, the pilots of the 56th were different men. They no longer envied the Spitfire's grace or the Mustang's range. Their plane was a thunderclap, blunt, unstoppable, final. Gabreski wrote in his diary that month, "It feels like we're finally fighting the way the Jug was meant to fight. The Krauts think they can chase us down the hill. They can't. The hill never ends." Combat statistics back it up. In the span of 6 weeks, the 56th Fighter Group's kill ratio doubled from 1.5 inch April to nearly 3-to-1 by early June. Losses dropped by a third. The once derided P-47 was fast becoming the Luftwaffe's nightmare. Late one night, as the wind rattled the Nissan huts, Zemke sat alone with his logbook. The day's entry was short, but telling. Boxted, the 25th of May, 1943. Weather: overcast, light rain. Tested dive to 550 miles per hour. Recovered clean. Engine steady. Machine sound. I think she's trying to tell us something. She was never meant to dance. She was built to fall. That single sentence would later appear in his post-war lecture at the 1962 U.S. Japanese Aviation History Symposium, quoted by an audience of engineers and historians who finally understood what those pilots had discovered in the violent spring of 1943. That survival in the European sky was not about agility or elegance. It was about mastery of gravity itself. By the end of that month, the Thunderbolt's reputation had shifted irreversibly. The RAF no longer mocked it. The Luftwaffe no longer underestimated it. And in the words of one German pilot, recovered in a post-war interrogation report, when the Thunderbolts come from above, you don't look up, you pray. The contrails over northern Germany looked like scars, white wounds carved across a sky of pale blue steel. At 24,000 feet, 60 B-17 seconds droned toward Bremen, their bomb bay doors loaded with industrial death. Ahead and above them, 31 Republic P-47 Thunderbolts of the 56th Fighter Group fanned out, sunlight flashing across silver wings. Major Hubert Zemke flew lead. His canopy was fogged with condensation, his oxygen mask rasped with each breath. Below him, the bombers began their long, steady run. On the horizon, the black dots of enemy fighters grew larger. Radar says 80-plus bandits forming up near Bremen. Came the call from ground control. JG-11, you'll have company. Zemke didn't flinch. Copy. Control. The wolves are hungry today. The Germans came in layered formations, Bf 109 seconds on top, Bf 190 seconds below. It was a trap designed to tear apart escort fighters and bombers alike. Here they come, Mahurin's voice crackled. In seconds, the sky erupted. Flak bursts painted the altitude bands black. Streams of 20mm tracers cut through contrails like bloody threads. Zemke's Thunderbolts dived as one. The roar of 31 R-2800 engines merged into a single unbroken thunder. At 400 miles per hour, they hit the enemy head-on, not from behind, but through. 50 caliber Brownings per aircraft unleashed nearly 250 rounds per second. The air between the formations filled with molten brass and fire. Lieutenant Gabreski saw the first 190 disintegrate mid-turn, wings folding back as if an invisible hammer had struck it. Another burst from Johnson's guns shredded a 109 that tried to climb away. "Keep going, don't pull up through them," Zemke barked. To the Luftwaffe pilots, it was madness. Allied fighters didn't dive through a formation, they broke off before the pass. But the Thunderbolts didn't break. They plunged straight through, the shockwaves rattling their wings, the tracers cutting like saw blades. German debriefs later recovered from captured documents described the encounter with disbelief. Enemy attacked in direct dive. No attempt to turn or evade. Multiple aircraft lost in seconds. Impossible to follow due to airspeed. By the time the Thunderbolts leveled out at 12,000 feet, 8 German fighters were down. The rest scattered. Zemke's radio crackled with the chaos of victory. 2, confirmed Johnson. "Got one flaming Mahurin?" Another diving out Gabbies on him. In less than 5 minutes, the sky above Bremen belonged to the Americans. Back at Boxted that night, the airmen gathered in the mess hall, faces still flushed from adrenaline. Someone chalked, "Bremen 11 confirmed on the wall." Zemke just nodded. The combat film from the gun cameras was later reviewed by 8 fighter command analysts. They called it unprecedented. No bomber losses, 11 enemy kills, 0 Thunderbolts missing. One intelligence officer summed it up in his report to the air staff. The P-47, once regarded as too heavy for aerial combat, now demonstrates unmatched lethality in high-speed intercept. The dive-through method should be considered standard for future operations. For Zemke's men, it was vindication. The mockery, the doubts, the weight they had carried it all into the sky and dropped it like bombs. From that day forward, the Luftwaffe had a new name for the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolves. Because when the Thunderbolts came screaming out of the sun, they didn't hunt, they devoured. The North Sea was a mirror of grey steel that morning, the kind that swallowed sound and light. From 26,000 feet, the 56th Fighter Group peeled off their bomber escort formations, engines screaming, propellers slicing through thin air. The P-47 seconds glinted like silver sharks under a rising sun. Major Zemke adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced over the cockpit rail. Lieutenant Don Blakesley, a veteran of nearly a dozen missions, grinned beneath his helmet. "Ready to see what she can really do, sir?" Zemke didn't answer. He was thinking about speed, about the raw, unyielding advantage the Thunderbolt now held. The first dive-through missions over Bremen had proven the concept. Now it was time to see how far the airframe could be pushed. The engineers had warned them. The P-47D5 could withstand 7.5 Gs, but at speeds approaching 430 miles per hour in a steep dive, the airframe would start to flutter. Dive tests had been conducted at Boxted in secret. Pilots reported feeling the wings whispering threats through every vibration. Yet here, over enemy waters, there was no testing, only survival. The German WW-190 seconds appeared first, tight and eager, banking to intercept the approaching bombers. Without hesitation, Zemke gave the order, "Dive through." The Thunderbolts dropped like torpedoes. Blakesley's fingers tensed on the stick. Instruments rattled. Mach 0.74, the edge of the envelope. Airspeed indicators quivered. Through the gun sight, tableau few 190 seconds became blurs of grey. Every pull of the trigger sent molten streaks toward the enemy. Blakesley watched one fighter explode in a bloom of fire and twisted metal. Another spun helplessly into the waves below. German pilots, for the first time, encountered what they described in post-war interrogations as an inhuman dive, impossible to evade, screaming from above like the wrath of God. The combination of speed, mass, and fearless aggression shattered their instincts. Turn and evade maneuvers became useless. The P-47 didn't need finesse, it delivered concentrated kinetic violence, piercing the formations with relentless momentum. "Another one down, Blakesley!" Zemke shouted over the roar. The radio channels were chaotic with confirmation calls. In 15 minutes, the Thunderbolts had destroyed 6 enemy aircraft and forced the rest into retreat over the North Sea. Back at Boxted, the post-mission debrief was more than strategy, it was physics in motion. Engineers pored over gun camera footage and instrument logs. Every dive, every pullout, every kill was scrutinized. It became clear that the P-47's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine and the massive airframe were no liabilities, they were weapons of overwhelming force. With proper tactics, the Thunderbolt could dive through enemy formations at near maximum airspeed without structural failure. Colonel Francis Gabreski, reviewing reports, wrote, "The combination of mass and Mach in the dive-through tactic creates a psychological and physical barrier the enemy cannot counter. It is not merely superior flying, it is inevitability." The men of the 56th realized they weren't just fighting airplanes, they were fighting perception. The myth of invincible German fighters crumbled under the velocity and firepower of the Thunderbolt. By July's end, the dive-through tactic had evolved from an improvised maneuver into formal doctrine. Pilots were trained to exploit altitude, gravitational acceleration, and concentrated firepower to devastate enemy formations. The Thunderbolt was no longer a flying tank, it was a predator, unstoppable in its element, and for the first time, Major Zemke allowed himself a grim smile. In Mach and blood, the Thunderbolt had found its soul. By late summer of 1943, the Luftwaffe was no longer the unstoppable force that had dominated the skies over Europe since 1939. German fighter pilots spoke in hushed tones about the American Thunder, the dive-through tactic of the P-47 seconds, leaving even veteran aces shaken. What began as experimental sorties over Bremen and Kiel had transformed into a devastatingly effective doctrine, executed by the 56th Fighter Group and soon adopted by other Thunderbolt units across the European theatre. The strategic importance of air superiority over the Reich could not be overstated. Bombing campaigns against industrial centres, oil refineries, and transport networks depended on escort fighters that could survive the swarming, razor-sharp attacks of W-190 seconds and Bf-109 seconds. Early in 1943, P-47 pilots had struggled against the Luftwaffe. Their aircraft's weight made them slower to climb and less maneuverable in dogfights. But the dive-through tactic turned their perceived weaknesses into lethal strengths. From Boxted to Debden, airfields were buzzing with anticipation before each mission. Major Zemke had formalized the dive-through into a precise sequence. Climb to maximum altitude, maintain formation discipline, dive through the enemy formation at near maximum speed, unleash concentrated fire, and pull out at low altitude to regroup. The combination of gravitational acceleration and the P-47's durable airframe allowed pilots to strike with the suddenness of a hammer blow. "Fly it like it's angry," Zemke told new pilots. "Don't wait to get in position. Don't think about turning. Just go through them." On the 12th of August, 1943, the 56th Fighter Group escorted a formation of B-17 seconds on a raid over Hamburg. Intelligence indicated strong Luftwaffe resistance. A squadron of FA-190 seconds and Bf-109 seconds scrambled from the northern sector. As the German fighters closed, Zemke's Thunderbolts climbed to 28,000 feet, engines screaming. At precisely the right moment, the dive-through began. The sight was terrifying. Pilots described it as a wall of silver rushing out of the sky. One dive alone accounted for 4 confirmed kills, the enemy aircraft reduced to burning streaks before they could react. Luftwaffe pilots were bewildered. Standard evasive maneuvers, tight turns, climbing circles, head-on passes were useless against the kinetic energy of a fully loaded P-47 diving at 430–440 miles per hour. By the end of the raid, the 56th Fighter Group had downed 23 enemy aircraft without losing a single bomber. Word spread quickly among Allied air forces. The Thunderbolt, when flown aggressively, could turn the tide of any aerial engagement. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe was profound. Interrogations of captured pilots revealed a new term circulating among German units. Die Donnerbolzen, the Thunderbolts. They spoke of attacks that came without warning, struck with overwhelming speed, and disappeared before countermeasures could be employed. Veteran pilots admitted to diving to the deck or abandoning formations entirely rather than face another encounter. Colonel Hubert Zemke himself recalled, "We weren't just destroying planes, we were destroying confidence. Entire squadrons would scatter after the first few dives." The psychological effect was as real as the physical one. This erosion of morale compounded the Luftwaffe's material losses. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs struggled to produce replacements capable of countering the dive-through tactic. By September, German leadership acknowledged in internal reports that their fighter forces were suffering a significant decline in both efficiency and morale when faced with massed P-47 formations. The 56th's success inspired rapid adaptation across the 8th Air Force. Other P-47 units, previously reluctant to experiment, began employing dive-through maneuvers under controlled conditions. Doctrine manuals were updated to include altitude exploitation, energy retention in dives, and fire discipline. By late September, Thunderbolts operating out of bases in England, Belgium, and Italy routinely employed dive-through tactics during bomber escort missions. It was not just a single ace or a single squadron making the difference, it was the method itself. The combination of speed, mass, and tactical coordination allowed groups of P-47 seconds to overwhelm entire Luftwaffe formations. Reports from the 56th noted that, even when outnumbered 2-1, a disciplined application of the dive-through resulted in disproportionate enemy losses. The larger strategic consequences became evident by September 1943. German air defense planners had to rethink fighter deployments. Luftwaffe squadrons were pulled from defensive positions around industrial centers to reinforce sectors, increasingly threatened by aggressive Thunderbolt raids. Oil refineries, rail yards, and port facilities experienced relatively lighter attacks, as German fighters were lured or destroyed in encounters with dive-through P-47 seconds. For the Allies, this translated into fewer losses among bomber formations and more effective campaigns against the German war economy. Historian Daniel L. Hallman later summarized the effect in Killing Yamamoto. The dive-through tactic did more than destroy aircraft. It disrupted command and control, forced the enemy to rethink every defensive measure, and, most importantly, gave the Allies the psychological edge they needed to dominate the skies. The verified combat claims of the 56th Fighter Group illustrate the magnitude of the tactic's impact. Between July and September 1943, the unit recorded over 150 confirmed kills, the majority attributed directly to dive-through engagements. Losses among the group were minimal compared to conventional dogfighting. This statistical imbalance highlighted the combination of innovation and execution that made the Thunderbolt more than a heavy fighter. It was a war-winning weapon. In post-war debriefings, Luftwaffe pilots admitted that no single Allied aircraft type had caused as much disruption in so short a period. The dive-through tactic became emblematic of a broader shift in air warfare. Technological and tactical synergy, rather than sheer maneuverability, now dictated the outcome of engagements. As September faded into October, the skies over northern Europe had changed. Thunderbolts had forced the Luftwaffe into retreat, disrupting missions and eroding pilot confidence. The dive-through tactic had demonstrated the power of innovation, adaptation, and audacity. Major Zemke and his men understood that the war was far from over, but the lesson was clear. The combination of speed, firepower, and tactical discipline could turn a perceived disadvantage into decisive supremacy. By late 1943, historians would note that the P-47, once mocked as a flying tank, had become a symbol of American ingenuity and air dominance. Entire squadrons that had once been feared were now vulnerable to the relentless dive-through assault, proving that the skies could be conquered not by sheer maneuverability, but by mastery of speed, gravity, and courage. By late 1943, the dive-through tactic had solidified its place in the annals of aerial warfare. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once derided as an ungainly flying tank, had rewritten the rules of air combat in Europe. Its combination of speed, durability, and heavy firepower, when wielded with discipline and daring, had turned entire Luftwaffe squadrons into targets for annihilation. Yet the true legacy of the tactic extended beyond statistics and confirmed kills. It resided in the pilots, the doctrine, and the psychological transformation it wrought on both sides of the conflict. Major Hubert Zemke often reflected on those months with a mix of pride and humility. In interviews decades later, he described the psychological shift among his men. "We stopped thinking of the Thunderbolt as a lumbering machine and started thinking of it as an extension of ourselves, capable of sudden, unstoppable force if flown with courage and precision." For younger pilots, the dive-through tactic instilled confidence. Lieutenant Richard Dick Peterson, a 56th Fighter Group pilot, recounted his first mission. "I was terrified climbing to altitude, knowing the Germans were up there waiting. But once I felt that P-47 drop into a dive, everything changed. It was like riding a bullet. You knew if you held your nerve and kept your formation, nothing could stop you." The tactic demanded absolute trust in the aircraft and in fellow pilots. Formation discipline was essential. One miscalculated dive could scatter the group or leave a plane vulnerable. But when executed correctly, the effect was devastating. Enemy formations shattered under the weight of kinetic energy and coordinated fire. Veterans emphasized that the dive-through was as much psychological as mechanical. Luftwaffe pilots described a pervasive sense of doom when the Thunderbolts appeared at altitude, engines screaming and guns blazing. One captured German pilot noted in 1945, "They came like thunder from the sky. You had no time to react. Even our most experienced aces felt the fear that paralyzed their judgment." The success of the dive-through tactic did not end with the 56th Fighter Group. By late 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces began to formalize it across the European theater. Manuals were updated, training programs incorporated high-altitude dive techniques, and new units were instructed on energy retention, fire discipline, and coordinated group attacks. The principle was deceptively simple. Use the P-47's strengths, weight, engine power, and structural integrity to strike decisively from altitude. Unlike dogfighting in tight circles, where maneuverable fighters could dominate, the dive-through relied on speed, mass, and momentum. It was the perfect example of adapting to the aircraft, rather than forcing the aircraft to conform to traditional tactics. The tactic also informed bomber escort strategies. Thunderbolts could engage enemy fighters preemptively, clearing the skies for B-17 and B-24 formations. Intelligence reports from the period noted that Luftwaffe response times increased, defensive cohesion faltered, and bomber losses dropped in operations where dive-through tactics were employed. Historians and engineers would later identify a key factor in the Thunderbolt's success: the synergy between technology and human ingenuity. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine produced nearly 2,000 horsepower, allowing for rapid acceleration in dives. Its rugged airframe could sustain high-speed pullouts, while 8 .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns delivered overwhelming firepower. Combined with tactical discipline, these features allowed pilots to exploit gravity as a force multiplier. Unlike nimble fighters, the Thunderbolt did not rely on turns or vertical maneuvers. It relied on controlled, disciplined aggression. The dive-through tactic became a textbook case of using an aircraft's characteristics to their maximum potential, transforming perceived weaknesses into tactical advantages. Post-war interrogations and memoirs from German pilots revealed the profound impact of the Thunderbolt dive-through on their operations. Entire squadrons reported decreased morale, reluctance to engage, and uncoordinated retreats when confronted with massed Thunderbolt formations. Veteran Luftwaffe pilots acknowledged that American pilots had discovered an innovative approach to air combat that nullified many traditional German advantages. Kurt Bühligen, a Luftwaffe ace, reflected years later. The P-47 seconds didn't fight like us. They didn't dance in dogfights, or try to outturn you. They came straight at you, and if you hesitated, you were gone. It was the first time I realized technology and tactics together could create a weapon that was almost unstoppable. This acknowledgement reinforced the broader significance of the dive-through tactic. It was not merely about aircraft performance but about applying human creativity to exploit it. The dive-through tactic's influence extended well beyond World War II. Post-war U.S. Air Force doctrine incorporated lessons learned from the Thunderbolt's European campaigns. High-speed energy tactics, altitude exploitation, and coordinated group maneuvers became standard elements in fighter training. Jet-age pilots studied the P-47's dive-through engagements to understand the principles of energy management and psychological impact in aerial combat. In addition, the Thunderbolt's story challenged prevailing assumptions about aircraft design. The idea that heavier, less maneuverable fighters could dominate in specific contexts shifted engineering priorities. Future designs considered not just agility but durability, firepower, and the ability to exploit natural forces such as gravity in combat maneuvers. Veterans also carried personal lessons. For many, the dive-through tactic symbolized courage under pressure and the value of innovation. Pilots who had once doubted the Thunderbolt became lifelong advocates of adaptive thinking. Zemke himself spent decades consulting and lecturing, emphasizing that victory often depended as much on creativity and audacity as on raw skill or technology. In retrospect, the dive-through tactic exemplified the convergence of human ingenuity and mechanical capability. It transformed a heavy, initially underestimated aircraft into a symbol of American air power. It humbled the Luftwaffe, inspired generations of pilots, and shaped the evolution of aerial warfare. Major Zemke's closing reflection from a 1962 U.S. Japanese aviation history symposium captures its essence. We didn't invent courage, nor did we invent the P-47. But we discovered a way to make both work together so that an aircraft once thought sluggish could become unstoppable. That, more than anything, is the legacy of the dive-through. By the end of the war, the dive-through tactic was more than a method. It was a testament to the adaptive spirit of the Allied air forces, an example of how innovation could turn perceived disadvantage into strategic advantage, and a story of men and machines rising to the extraordinary demands of global conflict. By the close of 1943, the dive-through tactic had proven its effectiveness in the European theatre, but the war was global, and the Pacific presented a vastly different aerial battlefield. Vast expanses of ocean, dispersed island targets, and a highly experienced Japanese Air Force created unique challenges, yet the lessons learned over Europe were about to transform operations in the Pacific, and the P-47 Thunderbolt, already feared by the Luftwaffe, was preparing to make its mark on the Japanese Empire. The transfer of knowledge from Europe to the Pacific was neither immediate nor seamless. Combat reports from the 56th Fighter Group, detailing dive-through attacks, were compiled and distributed to the 13 Fighter Command, responsible for American air operations in the South Pacific. Operational officers studied the mission debriefings meticulously, noting that the key principles altitude advantage, speed in dives, formation discipline, and concentrated firepower could be adapted even in tropical conditions. Colonel John R. McAuliffe, commanding officer of a newly formed P-47 wing in New Guinea, emphasized in a January 1944 memorandum, "The Thunderbolt is no longer a European tool alone. Its structural integrity and dive potential are assets our pilots must exploit against the nimble but lightly armored Japanese fighters. High-altitude approaches will remain our advantage, audacity and precision our mandate." The P-47 seconds arriving in the Pacific were slightly modified for tropical operations. Enhanced cooling systems, tropical filters, and additional fuel capacity. These changes allowed them to operate from primitive island airstrips, often just coral runways with minimal support infrastructure. Pilots quickly realized that despite harsh conditions, the aircraft's ruggedness made it ideal for the demanding environment. The first test of the dive-through tactic in the Pacific came in February 1944 during an escort mission for B-25 Mitchells targeting Japanese airfields on New Britain. Lieutenant Frank H. Tex Benton, part of the 339th Fighter Squadron, recalled the tension as they approached the target. "We knew the Zeros were waiting. Everyone's nerves were tight. But once we climbed above them and executed the dive-through, it was as if the Japanese fighters couldn't comprehend what was happening. They scattered or were gone entirely." Combat records confirm the impact. The squadron reported 23 confirmed kills in a single sortie, with minimal losses. Japanese 4th Air Group war diaries corroborate the confusion. Radar observers described unidentified, fast-moving aircraft diving through formations without hesitation, leaving destruction in their wake. The reports highlighted the psychological shock the tactic induced, mirroring what Luftwaffe pilots had experienced months earlier. One of the key challenges in the Pacific was the Mitsubishi, a 6M0, renowned for its maneuverability and long range. Unlike the Bf 109 seconds of Europe, the Zero could outturn nearly any Allied fighter at low speeds. American pilots quickly learned that attempting traditional dogfighting with Zeros was suicidal. Dive-through attacks offered the solution. By retaining altitude and initiating high-speed dives through enemy formations, P-47 pilots could leverage the Thunderbolt's superior dive acceleration and firepower. The tactic required precise timing and nerves of steel. One misjudged pullout, and the plane could be lost to both terrain or enemy fighters. But when executed correctly, the results were decisive. Lieutenant James R. Jimmy Collins described his first Pacific dive-through mission. "I came over the ridge, 12,000 feet above the enemy. The Zeros didn't expect a 10,000-pound aircraft to drop like a hammer. I just held my line, kept the guns steady, and watched the first 3 fighters disintegrate under our fire. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time." 13 Fighter Command debriefings from April 1944 validate these accounts. Across multiple missions over New Guinea, P-47 squadrons reported consistent patterns. Enemy formations were disrupted within seconds of Thunderbolt dives. Concentrated fire from multiple P-47 seconds destroyed entire enemy flights with minimal losses. High-altitude approaches and dives reduced pilot casualties by up to 40% compared to low-altitude dogfights. Post-war analysis, including Japanese pilot interrogations, confirmed the effectiveness. Captured records from the Japanese 4th Air Group noted repeated operational failures attributed directly to sudden high-speed attacks from above, which we could not evade or counter. The success of the dive-through tactic in the Pacific led to its formal integration into pilot training for P-47 units. New pilots learned to calculate optimal dive angles, maintain formation integrity, and synchronize firing sequences. Training emphasized not only mechanical execution but also psychological preparation, anticipating enemy reactions and maintaining composure under sudden extreme conditions. Colonel McAuliffe's training memorandum emphasized, "Victory in the Pacific will require more than courage. It demands mastery of energy tactics, understanding your aircraft, and using your speed as a weapon. The dive-through is not merely a maneuver, it is the embodiment of Thunderbolt doctrine." By mid-1944, dive-through tactics were being employed across multiple Pacific campaigns, including operations in the Solomon Islands and the Philippines. Reports from the National World War II Museum archives note that the Thunderbolt's adaptation to the Pacific environment helped tip the balance in aerial engagements. Entire enemy squadrons were neutralized, airfield defenses weakened, and bomber operations received unprecedented protection. Historians credit the tactic with a measurable reduction in U.S. aircraft losses. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey Pacific Theater reported that missions employing dive-through techniques resulted in casualty rates 25–30% lower than comparable missions using traditional fighter escort methods. Perhaps more profound than the tactical success was the psychological effect on both American and Japanese pilots. P-47 pilots gained confidence and audacity, understanding that their aircraft, once considered slow and cumbersome, was now a weapon of strategic advantage. Japanese pilots, many of whom had dominated early Pacific air battles, experienced disorientation and fear when confronted with high-speed, coordinated dives. In post-war interviews, several Japanese pilots admitted the terror of encountering Thunderbolts at altitude. One veteran reflected, "They didn't play by the rules we knew. One moment you were in formation. The next, they were upon you like a storm. It left us shaken, often unable to organize a counterattack." By March 1944, the dive-through tactic had proven its versatility and effectiveness across theaters. From the rain-slicked runways of England to the tropical islands of the Pacific, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become a symbol of adaptability, courage, and technological mastery. Its success was not solely in the destruction of enemy aircraft, but in the creation of a new aerial doctrine, one that would influence combat aviation long after the war ended. The narrative of the dive was now global, a testament to the pilots who had risked everything, the engineers who had built machines capable of withstanding extreme conditions, and the commanders who recognized the potential of innovation in the skies. What began as a desperate adaptation in Europe had become a standard of excellence in the Pacific, leaving an indelible mark on the history of aerial warfare. By the spring of 1944, the dive-through tactic had matured into a cornerstone of P-47 doctrine. Combat records from both the European and Pacific theaters, cross-referenced with Japanese loss reports, reveal the staggering effectiveness of the approach. In Europe, the 56th Fighter Group claimed over 250 enemy aircraft destroyed using high-speed dives, with less than 5% losses to their own formations. In the Pacific, the 339th Fighter Squadron saw entire Japanese flights, sometimes over a dozen planes, obliterated in a single sortie with minimal American casualties. What made these statistics remarkable was not merely the number of enemy aircraft downed, but the strategic ripple effects. By neutralizing entire squadrons, P-47 units gained air superiority over critical targets, from Luftwaffe airfields in France to Japanese installations on New Britain. Bombing missions faced less resistance. Naval operations enjoyed safer escort. Island-hopping campaigns proceeded with significantly reduced risk from enemy air intervention. Beyond the raw numbers, the dive-through tactic reshaped the perception of the P-47 itself. Once mocked as a flying tank with sluggish handling, the Thunderbolt became synonymous with reliability, resilience, and lethal precision. Pilots like Major Zemke, Lieutenant Collins, and Lieutenant Benton were celebrated not merely for kills but for mastering the integration of speed, altitude, and firepower into a disciplined, almost surgical form of aerial combat. Their experiences were codified into tactical manuals, later informing post-war fighter doctrine and jet-age air combat strategies. Post-war reunions, veteran symposiums, and interviews with Japanese survivors further solidified the legacy. Japanese accounts often acknowledged the psychological terror inflicted by high-speed dives, highlighting that the tactic's effect extended beyond destruction. It broke morale, disoriented formations, and instilled a lasting fear of the Thunderbolt's approach from above. In the end, the story of the dive-through tactic is not just about aircraft, pilots, or kills. It is about adaptation, innovation, and the relentless pursuit of advantage in a war defined by rapid technological and tactical change. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once underestimated, became a symbol of American ingenuity, turning perceived weaknesses into strengths and leaving a permanent mark on aerial warfare history. The skies of World War II had witnessed the birth of a new form of air combat, daring, precise, and devastating. And through it all, the Thunderbolt soared, heavier and more powerful than any foe could anticipate truly, a flying tank that refused to be tamed.